Shulva, Sanctum City, has to be one of the most beautiful and one of the most unique locations across all of Dark Souls. I love the almost Aztec and Mayan aesthetic to this place, with the great pyramids and the rituals to appease a great being, in this case, the slumbering dragon of Shulva. Like many infamous locations in the Dark Souls series, it carries over the poison theme, but out of all like the quote-unquote poison environments in Dark Souls, Shulva has to be one of the absolute best in my opinion. It's just a very grand and atmospheric area to explore, and it made for an excellent first step into the DLC trilogy for Dark Souls 2. In Scholar of the First Sin, you don't have to technically play this first, but since that's the first expansion that came out, I usually do start with Shulva Sanctum City. Plus, I just love the design of this place, and the final boss of this area is one of my favorite bosses, not only in Dark Souls 2, but of the entire series. Now, these soldiers will fight all throughout Shulva. Were once loyal soldiers of the army of the Sunken Kingdom, but much like the rest of the city, they have fallen into disarray and have been consumed by the poison that has overtaken this place. One of their weapons, the Sanctum mace, reads, "A mace wielded by Sanctum soldiers. This mace was corrupted by poison when Sin, the slumbering dragon, awoke. A mere mortal would be asphyxiated by the poison emitted when wielding this mace, but for the noxious Sanctum soldiers, this fact matters none." So this confirms that the dragon we saw when we first entered this area is in fact Sin, the slumbering dragon, and is the creature responsible for this plague that has basically overtaken the city. But as you can guess, it wasn't always this way. Shulva was once a grand city, even more than it is when we visit it now, that worshipped the dragon Sin, and he essentially was in eternal slumber. That's why he was called the Slumbering Dragon. He rested for untold eons, but then something happened. Something that threw this kingdom into chaos. It was something that was caused from a threat from the outside world, but also within the kingdom itself. I would like to point out that Shulva is one of the more puzzle-heavy areas in Dark Souls 2. It's nothing too complicated, mind you. This isn't like an adventure game where you have to solve these grandiose puzzles or anything like that. But in terms of switches and hidden rooms, there are plenty of those in Shulva. Like in this first section of the area, you have to hit these little pillars to activate these even grander pillars, which you can use to access different areas of the kingdom. But once we get into the more central pyramids of this kingdom, there are even more hidden switches and secrets that are hidden all over the place, so there's a lot of cool stuff to discover here. It's one of the more jam-packed areas in the game just because there's so many things you can easily miss, and even in this video I'm not going to explore the entire city, so I'm not going to go to the Cave of the Dead, just putting it out there. I'm not going to any of the co-op areas in these expansions, just because they can be a bit of a grind to play through by yourself, and I personally don't enjoy the bosses too much that are at the end of each of these sections. Not that they're terrible, they're just not my favorites, and I'd rather focus on other things in this playthrough. But going back to my main point here, I just love the unique game mechanics within Shulva, finding all the little hidden switches and discovering what doors they open or what goodies they lead to. There's lots of treasures you can find in this area if you know how to get to them. It occurred to me while I was playing this section that I actually haven't gone into depth much on the sorcery lore for Dark Souls 2. I actually really like playing as a sorcerer in these games. I know sometimes people consider it like the easy mode, but I would disagree for a variety of reasons. But regardless, there are some pretty interesting things in terms of story regarding sorceries, and I think one of the most compelling bits of lore is here in Shulva, where we find the unique sorcery Focus Souls. An ancient sorcery of Shulva, the Sanctum city, fires a focused beam of souls. The development of sorceries was stunted in Shulva, as they were considered taboo. Even so, there were some occasional gems created by a group of nameless enthusiasts. So what I like about that is, even though sorceries were kind of frowned upon here in Shulva, that there were still those who practiced in this art of magic and tried to create their own takes on it, and as a result we get Focus Souls, which is one of the more unique spells in the sorcery library. It's pretty spiffy looking. Now these guys creep me out to no end, especially on my first playthrough. I have a confession to make. I am terribly afraid of any ghost enemies in games. I know in the first Dark Souls, New Londo is by far the creepiest area in that game for me, just because the ghosts and the atmosphere. It makes it just terrifying to me. So the ghost guardians of this pyramid are equally so, because these soldiers, you can't directly damage them. The only way to get rid of them is to attack the armor sets, which are on their coffins. To go in more depth about the Sanctum Knights, here's a little bit of lore of them from their armor set. Armor of the Sanctum Knights. The Sanctum Knights renounce their own flesh to eternally guard the Sanctum from Sir Jorg and his Drakeblood Knights. Now, this is the first mention of one of the key players in the story of Shulva, and the awakening of Sin, the Slumbering Dragon. Sir Jorg and his Drakeblood Knights at some point invaded the kingdom, and in effort to repel these invaders, the Sanctum Guardians, the Sanctum Knights, they either were blessed with some miracle, or perhaps more likely some sort of curse, in that they renounced their flesh and took on those ghostly forms that we previously saw in order to fend off the invaders, thus making the Sanctum Knights a whole lot harder to take down. We learn even a little bit more in the Sanctum Knight crossbow, which is one of the more unique weapons in this expansion. Crossbow wielded by Sanctum Knights. Strong attack fires dark bolts. These Guardian Knights were sentenced to eternal stewardship of the Sanctum in a clandestine ritual carried out in the Great Depths. But today, the Sanctum receives nary a visitor. So in some capacity, the Sanctum Knights were successful in the ritual they undertook, in that it did help them defend the kingdom, but I believe it was kind of too little too late at that point. Because while we will come into contact with some Drakeblood Knights within the kingdom, it's my belief that they've gone hollow. Either that, or they are in servitude to someone who influenced these events, or at least someone who I believed influenced these events. So for all intents and purposes, Shulva, the Sunken Kingdom, has become practically a ghost town. The only truly living inhabitant here is someone we'll find deep below the pyramid, and beyond that, the one who was once the object of worship of this great kingdom, Sin, the Slumbering Dragon. The Sanctum priestesses are a really creepy enemy, and their dark magic can actually be surprisingly powerful, so you want to watch out for them. But these characters add a little more depth to the ceremonies and rituals of the Sunken Kingdom. Tiara of the Eternal Sanctum Priestesses prevents effects that block spells. This tiara has been warped by poison, adding to its already peculiar design. It is said that the priestesses sang to preserve the dragon's deep slumber, but one wonders if a single phrase of their song ever reached the dragon's ears. And I think that's rather interesting because we actually do hear singing several times throughout our travels into this pyramid, but I think the most rich voice we hear, the most beautiful of them all, comes from that character I said we'll find deep below the pyramid. But much like the Sanctum soldiers and the Sanctum knights, the Sanctum priestesses have been drenched in this poison that has flooded the kingdom, and it has overtaken their form and the garments they wore. So this tiara, as the description says, once might have been something beautiful, but now it just has a repulsive, disturbing look to it. It is kind of fascinating to think that what this place would look like in its prime. Of course, the same could be said about many areas in the Dark Souls series, but I think Shulva in particular, and these little bits of lore we hear kind of give us a little glimpse into what that previous kingdom might have been like. Maybe it wasn't a great place to live in to start with, but however great a kingdom this was, it has obviously fallen into ruin, and we'll have to make our way through the ruins of this kingdom to obtain our prize from this area, the crown of the Sunken King.